Hi, folks. Thanks for joining in today. A gentle trigger warning here, please. Today's episode has some mentions of suicide. So, if that is a triggering topic for you, please feel free to skip this one, practice self care. And if you do need to reach out to someone, if you are in Canada, please call or text 988 and you will be provided support. If you are outside of Canada, please take a pause, check in with yourself, and connect with your local crisis resources if needed. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Brown People Problems. Today we're talking about a topic that is really close to my heart and very, very interesting for me, and that is international students. And we're going to be talking about what is fact and what is fiction when it comes to international students in Canada, in particular, where we are in Ontario. But I imagine that folks from all over the world would really be able to resonate with a lot of our stats and our insights on international students. Joining me for this conversation is Angie Holstein. Welcome her back. She was actually the first episode of season 1, which also happens to be our most popular episode. If you haven't listened to it, go listen to it. Yeah, it's our most popular episode of season 1. So she's coming back to join us on this conversation. And also joining us today is Rohama Kabir. She is a psychotherapist as well with Angie. So you're familiar with Angie, but in case it's your first time joining us here today, Angie has been working in the mental health field for over 20 years. She's a registered social worker. She's been with CAMH, Havergal College, and worked with children, youth, adults, and families. Currently, she's a psychotherapist in private practice in Toronto, and she's a certified EMDR therapist. Angie has started a passion project called Shanti Psychotherapy, which is a second practice. It specializes in South Asian mental health. And though it's inclusive to all communities, it really focuses on the South Asian mental health piece. Angie currently lives in Toronto with her partner of 25 years and her 3 children. Welcome back, Angie.
Thank you, Nikita. It's awesome to be back. Congratulations on season 2.
Thank you. And we also have Rohama. I'm very excited to introduce her to you guys. She is a qualifying registered psychotherapist, and she's a former Pakistani international student who immigrated to the GTA for university about 7 years ago from the Middle East. So she's going to be bringing in a lot of lived experience, which I'm very excited about. She's also a South Asian woman who's working to help support people of color as they navigate life in Canada, along with recognizing the balance and effort that it takes to finding your own place here, specifically for students. I would imagine that whole third culture kid is going to come up. And she's currently a master's student and focusing on her own research surrounding dating violence and prevention, which also sounds really interesting. Welcome to the podcast, Rohama.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to dive into this discussion today. I imagine we're going to have lots to say about it, but let's talk about international students and what is going on. So, folks joining this podcast today, this episode today, may be coming in with their own opinions and their worldviews and their biases and their prejudices. We all have them towards this group. This group of folks, international students, has been making news for a long time, whether it's street violence, carjackings, deportations, you name it. So I want to talk about this population in particular, and I'm wondering if we can start off with just some facts and some stats on what's going on. I would like to get, if you would know this, but just a roundup of how many international students are coming into the GTA every year and what's going on there.
Yeah, so I think there is about 800 to 900,000 international students coming into Canada per year. As of 2023, it was estimated to be 900,000, but the number could be a little over. And the majority of them are coming from South Asian countries. And as of 2019, Ontario has the most or the highest number because it's one of the most popular provinces where people tend to move. Um, And so there is a very large number of those students that are holding study permits for colleges, for universities, for master's programs, PhD programs. And so there's a very large number of international students among the Canadian population right now.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like a lot. I always knew that there
Absolutely.
was a lot coming in. I just had no idea of like the actual numbers, but it helps to contextualize with that number.
Yeah, it's an insane amount of people, and I think there is a very clear lack of resources to support the sheer number of people that are coming in for
Mm-hmm.
school.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Something that I have been seeing a little bit in the news lately is suicide rates and just death
Mhm.
rates pertaining to this population. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what the coverage, what triggered some of the coverage
Mm,
and an attunement to this part of our population. We're looking at, you know, a number of international students per month. In fact, the numbers are so high related to suicide that, there's lots of grassroots organizations like Punjabi Community Health Center, for example, and in conjunction with other agencies where they support families in bringing their loved ones home.
mm,
That's what an epidemic and problem this is. So it's been a very hidden issue for years and years. My own parent was an international student in the 60s.
mm,
And, when I reflected on his stories, I could hear the mental health issues as an undercurrent of, his own story as well as the stories of his peers, and in fact had lost, people to suicide back then. So
oh,
it's taken a really long time for us to really shine a light um, on this issue and try to understand more about what the factors that are contributing to those kind of numbers for young people.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even recognizing that it is an issue, right? Because
Mhm.
what a lot of folks, and I don't want to generalize, but in my personal sort of circle, what a lot of folks see when you see international students is like the fancy cars, the rowdy behavior, and there's this sense of inferiority, Rohama, like you were saying earlier, right? This looking down upon them, but I don't think people realize that it's an issue. So, can we tell our listeners what's going on with these suicide rates pertaining to international students?
Yeah, I think it's increased, like Angie was saying, since COVID-19. The Punjabi Community Health Services came out with statistics that said there was an average of 5 international students per month.
Mm,
Um, and I think it was always something that I was aware of, something that I heard about even when I was an international student, something that was part of all of our lived experiences was just knowing this number was so high. But I think seeing it as a statistic really shocked me because it seems like that should be much lower. And I think as COVID and isolation, I know a lot of students were stuck here for years. I myself was stuck in Canada for 3 years during COVID. I wasn't able to go home. It increases so many of the mental health factors that we're going to talk about, right? There's so much isolation, there's so much helplessness. You're constantly struggling with visa issues, immigration issues. Like the second the country shut down, you're like at the bottom of the barrel for people that they're concerned about, right? In terms of reuniting with families, even though your education is online. And I think that played a really big role in a lot of the suicide rates that we saw with international students. When I was in school in 2017, 2018, I remember, and this is right before COVID hit, I remember there being like 2, 3 months where we would hear, like we would get an email from our university every other week talking about an international student that had died of suicide, talking about students that they were looking for. And it was, I felt really removed from it at the time because I had to force myself to. But now that I reflect on it, that's a very scary place to be in as a student. Even just hearing about those things, it makes you question your own mental health resources. It makes you question your own social support systems, and it really forces you to detach from it in order to survive.
Mm.
And I think that's not something that's very talked about.
No, and you're absolutely right. That statistic is very alarming. 5 a month in just the GTA.
I didn't specify, but I would want to say that at least 75% of that would be within the GTA, just
Yeah.
based on population numbers.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's a lot. I know I recently saw a video, I think it was on Instagram from the Brampton Crematorium, and they had released like a video talking about just the volume of international students that are dying by suicide. They're coming, whose bodies are coming to Brampton Crematorium, and they don't have enough resources to provide funeral services and house these folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this part of the statistic also came from Etobicoke, one
Mm.
of the Etobicoke funeral homes. So I want to say you're probably right in terms of it being mostly in the GTA.
Oh, yeah, that's awful. Yeah, 5 a month. Yeah, that's a lot. We don't hear about this. I don't know. Maybe I don't know if this is a function of media and news coverage being so
Hmm.
polarized and tailored to your algorithm, but I haven't heard
Absolutely.
much about this. And perhaps it's a blind spot of my own, but all I hear with international students and narrative is just the negative. And so this is really quite shocking to hear. This is very significant.
It's tough to know, right? Because in media, we
Hmm.
don't publish due to suicide contagion. We don't publish a lot of specifics, or people die by suicide every week, but we don't publish that, right? So there's what we do here is statistics, but statistics make us feel somewhat removed,
Mm,
right? There's no people, there's no feeling, there's no family behind that, 1 in 5 statistic
mm,
per month. We don't, it doesn't get in there. And we're all primed for denial around suicide, or that kind of, stigma and distancing that these problems don't live here. There's an otherness to those kind of problems, like
mm,
mental health issues or people dying by suicide, when we know as mental health professionals that there's no safeguards. Privilege won't safeguard you, right? The color of your skin doesn't safeguard you. That it can happen and be experienced by anybody. That's why, to your point, Rahama, we need to be really looking at prevention, first of all, because, our systems are really set up to be very reactive.
mm,
After the fact, we start talking. So,
Hmm.
prevention and having adequate resources and accountability within our systems here, but also the systems in, the countries of origin of these students.
mhm,
Because there's a whole system behind, and Rahama, of course, you know more about this. There's a whole system behind how students come to study abroad, right?
mm,
It's also big business in those countries.
mhm,
Um, so the exploitation factors are just so high. There was a recent article in the Toronto Star talking about how the government wants to reduce the number of students being allowed to come in as a way of dealing with all of this in
Hmm.
terms of what we're talking about. Well, not sure that that's actually going to be the intervention that's going to be super helpful versus prevention, working together, both countries, and having adequate resources for the schools that, you know, charge international students what they charge, triple the amount of domestic students.
mhm.
Need to do better.
Yeah, and like you're saying, there's no awareness around it. Several of my really, really good friends are international students, right? They moved to Canada for studies when we were 18. And that's been such a big part of their identity. And now they're, here. It's been like 10, 15 years. But as you're kind of talking, I'm reflecting on how there's never been any conversation around their experiences. It's just sort of taken for granted that they come from privileged backgrounds, that you have to come from a privileged background to be able to afford the fees, to be able to
Hmm.
justify the financial cost of you being here. And I think perhaps it's that belief that you come from a lot of privilege that makes it easy for us to villainize a lot of international
Yeah.
students, right? When you see like that what is that? Her Ontario and Steeles in Brampton, that plaza where there's every single week there's a fight. Like it's very easy to villainize these folks because you're assuming that they come from a lot of privilege and they're really spoiled and they don't understand what it is to be part of the Canadian community. And I think that's also what's fueling so much of this negative narrative around this.
Well, it's such an umbrella term, international students,
Mm.
right? Versus like there's a range of where students are studying. And if we look at, there's been recent articles about the number of international students coming to colleges. Again, they charge like 3 times the amount. And, we're looking at a very diverse socioeconomic group of people coming from countries like India, Pakistan. It's not necessarily that stereotype of privilege. We've got the spectrum of that because, a lot of students, what from my experience of speaking to international students is, they're working multiple jobs. They work in warehouses at night and they go to school during the day. The burnout factors are really, really high for many students. So I love what we're talking about around bursting that bubble of assumptions and stereotypes, right? That all students are privileged.
Yeah, if folks don't see that, right? People
Yeah.
see, somebody driving a Charger, a nice car with a really big sticker on it that says whatever it says. And we're very quick to make judgments and jump to conclusions and make assumptions. Um, and so I'm really glad we're having this conversation around this. Even with Algoma University right now, there seems to be something going on there in terms of failing students or not being particularly inclusive in the studies. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there was, and I actually didn't hear about this until very recently, which again shows how tailored even my media has become as someone that is an international student. But it was nearly, I want to say, 100+ students that were mostly of Indian origin, and they were all protesting in, sub-zero temperatures because a professor failed all of them in one IT class so that and a lot of them were protesting because this is a money-making technique. They
Mm.
fail the students that have to pay more so that
Oh.
they have to retake the course or redo the university, redo the semester. And as Angie's saying, a semester tuition is 3 times the amount of what it is for a domestic student. Um, and so due to the protests, the university issued a statement and they were marked pass out of the blue. And it was a whole like, that doesn't happen at universities. That doesn't happen at colleges unless there was a mistake made on their side. Like,
Mm.
from people I know that have been to colleges and universities, the system is not made to benefit students unless there's been a mistake on
Mm.
the side of the university. And that makes you really look at this and wonder what's going on here, and is this actually the money-making scheme that they're talking about? And I think it does boil down to tuition. Like if we look at tuition in colleges and universities, it is almost 3-4 times what it is for international students, but that's such a spread out people, like the people that are going to colleges and the people that are going to universities, they come from such varied socioeconomic backgrounds. So it's absolutely valid to say that some international students come to Canada with the financial privileges that makes life a lot easier for them versus a large population of international students come to Canada after saving for years and years and years. Their family have spent all of their savings to send them here for a better life, and to paint them all with the same brush, we're talking about 800, 900,000 people. If we paint them all with the same brush, then we're doing absolutely nothing
Mm.
to provide them with the resources and to hold the system accountable
Mm.
for bringing those students in. The reason there is so many international students is because they uphold the economy in so many ways. They all work multiple jobs, or majority of them. Even I'm generalizing so many times when I speak because
Mm.
it's the culture of
Mm.
when we're talking about international students, and I notice it in myself too. But there definitely needs to be accountability and a better allocation of resources, better planning, um, talking to students about the expectation and reality of what the economy looks like in Canada, what life looks like in Canada. Because everyone in Canada is struggling to some extent, and I feel like the burden really falls on the people that have no idea what it's going to be like when they come here.
Do we know why the fees are so, why are they 3 times the domestic student fees? Do we know why that is the case?
Because it's not subsidized. Government and I mean, domestic students get OSAP. So
Mhm.
if their fees were higher, OSAP would have to give them more money. But also it's subsidized. Universities have funding from the government for the amount
Mm.
of domestic students that they can take because their resources are significantly cheaper. They don't need to have insurance at the university because they're covered by OHIP versus international students. There's a lot more that goes into keeping them safe in terms of making sure that they have spaces in dorms, making sure that they have health insurance and dental insurance and all of those things. And so governments give universities less money to take international students, as far as I know.
Mm.
But it is significantly more expensive. Like you're paying upwards, some people are paying upwards of $80,000 to go to the University of Toronto. And this was as of when I was coming here and looking at costs. This was as of like 2015, 2016. I imagine it's higher because there's also no cap. So there's a cap on domestic students' tuition. It can only increase by a certain percentage, but there's no cap on university students' tuition. It could increase by 5 to 10% every year. Can't do anything about it.
Oh.
So there's a lot that goes into that. And I think even as students that are trying to go into master's programs, like I wasn't able to apply to so many universities because they were like, we don't have funding for international students, so just don't apply. I
Oh.
had multiple universities tell me to just not apply. And those are universities that have very high number of international students at the undergraduate level, but they have no funding to take me on as a master's student because obviously research needs to be subsidized, labs need to be
Mm.
subsidized, and they told me don't apply.
Oh my gosh.
So it's really difficult out here for students, even when they graduate and want to go into further education, if they want to stay here, they want to get jobs. It oftentimes takes a long time because they don't have Canadian experience. Nobody wants to give someone a chance for the first time for
Mm.
so many reasons. And a lot of that comes from prejudice towards international students. A lot of that comes from othering that Angie was saying. A lot of othering happens, and we paint a lot of international students with the same brush, right? They're rich, they have privilege, like they don't need to work this job versus a lot of them do if they
Mhm.
want to be able to get a work permit, if they want to be able to create a life here, if they want to be able to financially sustain themselves,
Mm.
they at some point want to move on from working 2 3 part-time jobs.
Mm.
I think the Canadian experience piece is what I've been hearing from students at the
Mhm.
college level, that what they're promised is not always delivered in terms of like internships or placements, and they're trying to navigate that and find their own placements in a Canadian system. It'd be like us going to India and trying to navigate as
Yeah.
Canadians that system. Like it's no different.
Mhm.
So I I think there's a lot to, there's a business component to
Mm.
schools. There just there has to be, right? And I think that's part of how do we start to monitor and look at health equity, because health equity isn't a favor, right? Health equity is about, providing equal opportunity to all contributing members of our community. And international students fuel our economy. They're working, as Rohama said, all these part-time jobs, very much contributing to the
Mm.
Canadian economy.
Yeah, and all the odd jobs. Yeah.
Yeah, like look at the Amazon warehouses.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of where international students are doing their work in these, because they afford, the overnight work so they can go to school during the day.
Mhm.
For
Mhm.
not a lot of pay.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes me curious. We talk about them having multiple jobs, and that certainly is the reality. When I talk to folks outside of this profession about it, I hear very different like narrative around it. So the narrative seems to be that all international students are, involved in crime, involved in carjackings, sex work. And I'm curious, do we have stats on this? And it's okay if we don't, but I'm curious about this. How many folks are actually involved in these things?
I tried to look this up for quite some time this week, and I actually was able to find no statistics. But when I look up instances of these things, the top four articles were talked about two international students that were victims of carjackings
Mm,
instead of the other way around. And I agree with what you're saying because I hear that a lot as well within the community. But when you're looking it up on the internet, and we say that with a pinch of salt, but I was seeing quite opposite
mm,
answers, but there isn't a lot of statistics talking about the percentages of these things.
I think we look at more exploitation from
Mhm.
what I've read, and in talking to female um, international students, that there is a pressure, and um, there's a lot of exploitation around sex work. So we
mm,
look at housing, for example. Some of the stories I hear is that in exchange for sexual favors, they can have free housing, right? So sex work has, again, also
right.
got a spectrum of how that shows up for folks. But I think in general, we look at more exploitation.
Mm,
Anyways, the basis of crime is typically born from lack of social determinants of health,
mm,
right? So there's, again, when we look at prevention, we tend to want to create good and bad because we really think, we live and work in anxious systems, so everything is good or bad, polarizing, versus, what contributes to crime, what contributes to exploitation of these students. What's happening? What do we need to change to reduce risk factors such as sex work, being
mm,
victims of crime and committing crime?
mm, mhm. Yeah, I really like how you said that we think in, yeah, polarized ways, black and white, right or wrong, good or bad. And that just makes me reflect on how much prejudice there is towards this group of international students, right now. And I'm curious, how do we explain this? What could this be potentially about? Because, my folks, my parents, my in-laws, a lot of the older folks in my family are in Brampton. So this is very much the narrative there. And we've had a couple international students, like second cousins and whatnot in the family who've come and who've done really well for themselves. But in the narrative there is, well, ours are okay, but all
Mhm.
the other ones are bad. Right. And so sometimes this just doesn't make sense to me. Like, why are we so prejudiced against our own people?
I think what you said is so accurate in terms of we really are prejudiced towards our own people
Mm,
more than, I mean, I don't want to say more than we see outside because we see othering and microaggression and internal racism so much in universities and institutions in Canada, but I think it's a very top-down approach.
mm,
It comes from the systems that have been placed. So, for example, in 2024, as of January, they changed the international student requirements. So now international students have to show $20,000 on top of all of the funding for their tuition, all of their living expenses, which if we think about this consistently and logically, a lot of people don't have that kind of money in their bank account. A lot of families, even middle class families in Southeast Asia, like I look at myself, I look at my friends, I look at a lot of people that are coming from Pakistan, from India, from Bangladesh, like a lot of people don't have that kind of funding all at once, right? Their parents are working people. Um, and so the reason that this came was to allow more underrepresented cohorts of international students to enter Canada, which to me just sounds like we want wealthier international
mm,
students than students that are struggling financially, so that we don't have to address the problems of expensive housing, no housing, a very expensive healthcare. We don't want to address these problems, so let's bring in wealthier international students that look less different from us, that look more like us, and
Mm.
it doesn't take into account the strength and immense amount of effort, energy, and money that it takes to bring a student here from a background that is not as privileged.
Mm-hmm. Even with that, what I'm hearing in between the lines of that narrative is that richer is better, right? It's less different, it's more like us, and so therefore they will behave in more Canadian ways. There'll be less crime, and there'll be less of this like acting out and polluting of the community. When that's not
Absolutely.
really the case. It's again our very classist ways of thinking.
And if that's how the systems are functioning, it places a lot of, I guess, allowance to other people to also behave that way within our communities and within our provinces. Because if you feel like you're able to be microaggressive towards people, if you feel like you're able to be racist towards people without a lot of, accountability, you're more likely to do that. And we see that. We see that all around Ontario. Um, and I think that's really sadly what's happening with
Mm.
a lot of international students that I speak to, in a professional sense, but also a lot of the international students I personally know.
And that's where it's also really important from the time before students leave, like all the preparation. Is it an accurate picture, of what it costs, the cost of living is here? Because there's such a vast, like when we look at the currency exchange, even
Mm.
like 20,000 Canadian dollars in rupees, good Lord, like it's such a big difference, right? And when we look at it, that was my sense when I was in India last year, just kind of talking to, international students, talking to school, like the preparatory schools there. The preparation phase feels very much more about the entrance exams and the visa. What about, when we see that the lack of preparation before leaving, and then students arriving here, and food banks being overrun by students near colleges because they can't,
Mhm.
there's not the preparation, there's not the funding to feed themselves.
Mm.
So this is where we get reactionary again. So it's like we start to close off. You have to have a certain amount of money. There's been families that send their young ones, and now they're ending up in the system. So they're international students at the high school level, right? As a ways of getting into the country. So you can hear and feel the reaction out of those, more those smaller issues that become bigger issues on our end, and just triggers again all the microaggression, all the, right, the keeping of levels of privilege or the right kind of minority that we want here.
Mm.
So there's such a, like, you can see and feel all the systems at play, and how at that, macro, meso level, we need to be addressing this before students are arriving here, making sure there's more robust resources here
Mm.
for them, because the food bank's response in many, London, Ontario, for example, was to deny international students from access from what was available at the food bank. And what a difficult decision to make, right? We only have so much as a resource. Who do we allocate that to?
Yeah.
What's happening on the frontline level?
Yeah, and if folks listening were not aware, there was a few months ago a photo went viral in the GTA where it was a food bank and they had a big sheet of paper just like taped on to the entrance that said not for international students or not accessible to international students. And I was shook when I saw that. I was like, but isn't that the whole purpose of a food bank is to be able to support those in need? And now how do we determine who has more or less of a need?
Exactly. And if we are allowing them to come into the country contribute to our economy, because international students are the bread and butter of universities and colleges, right? We have to, that's the accountability piece, that broader systemic look at what's happening versus just putting out these fires by putting up a sign to say we don't have enough resources. Maybe they don't, but that doesn't mean that we don't address the issue. We have to, I know there's always the more resources, more resources. What are the parts of the colleges and universities have here? Do we need on-campus food banks that are specific to students? What's the problem solving here, right?
Yeah.
That's health equity.
Yeah. That was part 1 of our chat on international students. Hope you enjoyed this. Tune in next week for part 2, where we're going to be talking a little bit more about Angie's and Rohama's role in supporting and making a change, and where do we go from here. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please stay tuned for our disclaimer. The guest and the host of Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.